Welcome back. Today we're stepping into a relationship that's, well, it's been tense for centuries, Vietnam and China. It feels historical, but the issues are very much alive right now.
Absolutely. And we're using a specific source, Shadows in the South China Sea, as our guide. It suggests there's more going on than just, the usual geopolitical jostling.
Right, so this isn't just our analysis. We're specifically unpacking the source's perspective. Its goal seems to be looking past the headlines, past the maritime spats.
And into the deeper currents. History, the big power plays,
Yeah.
and a pretty provocative angle the source presents about global elites and their alleged influence.
Okay, so guided by the source, we'll look at the South China Sea as the hotspot it is now. We'll trace that long, often difficult history between Vietnam and China.
We'll also examine that really surprising shift in the U.S.-Vietnam relationship.
Yeah, quite a turnaround. And we'll explore the motives the source claims are driving America's actions there today.
And then dive into the source's more, let's say, unconventional takes on hidden influences and some historical parallels it draws with leaders who apparently bucked the system.
Okay, let's ground ourselves first. The source points straight to the South China Sea as the powder keg.
Makes sense. China's claim, the nine-dash line, is huge.
Basically, China saying almost 90% of the sea is historically theirs, which, as the source notes, Vietnam and others completely reject.
Exactly. And the stakes.
Oh.
Immense. You've got potentially massive oil and gas reserves, vital fisheries.
Plus, some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world pass right through there. Control means, well, a lot of power.
Huge strategic and economic leverage, yeah.
And you see Vietnam, even though it's much smaller militarily, really digging its heels in, especially against China building those artificial islands.
And militarizing places like the Spratlys and Paracels. It definitely shows resolve.
A resolve the source connects back to a long history of resisting China. It mentions the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War, for example.
Right. China invaded after Vietnam moved into Cambodia. China claimed victory, but the source points out they took heavy casualties and pulled back without hitting their political aims.
And there were border clashes in the 80s too, apparently. So it's not just recent tension. There's real historical bad blood.
Deep mistrust, rooted in actual conflict, yeah.
So given that history, the next part the source discusses is, well, it's pretty ironic, America's role today.
It really is. When you remember the Vietnam War just a few decades back,
Hmm.
millions dead. The relationship now is almost hard to fathom.
The source says diplomatic ties were formally restored in 1995, and the driver, according to the source, a shared strategic need.
Yeah, basically to counterbalance China's growing strength in the region. That's the source's interpretation.
And it details how the U.S. backs Vietnam, now selling weapons.
Doing joint military drills, often in those very disputed waters.
And backing Vietnam diplomatically against China's claims in places like the UN. Quite the shift from enemies to, well, partners.
Strategic partners, at least. Driven by that shared concern over China, according to the source.
Which leads to the next big question the source tackles. What's in it for America? Why this pivot?
And the source lays out a few specific strategic gains it believes are motivating the U.S.
Top of the list seems to be containing China. Vietnam's presented as like a key part of the first island chain.
Right, that chain of islands, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Borneo. Strategists see it as a crucial line for controlling access to and from the Asian mainland.
So having a partner like Vietnam right there bordering China is strategically valuable.
Very much so. The source also brings up ongoing U.S. interest in access to ports, specifically mentions Cam Ranh Bay.
Which the U.S. used heavily during the war, of course.
Yeah, it's a fantastic deep water port, close to those South China Sea shipping lanes. Naval access there is a big deal.
Then there's the economic angle the source points to.
Yeah.
Companies moving manufacturing out of China. Vietnam's a potential destination, right?
That's part of the calculation the source presents. And, significantly, resources. The source mentions U.S. energy companies eyeing those oil and gas reserves.
Reserves that might be more accessible if China's dominance is checked.
That seems to be the implication in the source, yes. These are the core strategic and economic drivers it identifies for the U.S. shift.
But then the source takes a sharper turn. It moves beyond standard geopolitics.
This is where it introduces what it calls the hidden hands. Its perspective is that certain American elites, it names government insiders, defense contractors, corporate interest, have actively shaped global events for their own benefit.
It even frames some conflicts as wars, as business ventures. Cites Iraq and Afghanistan as examples.
Yeah, the source claims the stated reasons for those wars, WMDs, Specific terror links were later disputed or debunked.
But conveniently for some, they resulted in trillions flowing to contractors. Halliburton, Raytheon are mentioned.
The source's argument is that conflict itself becomes a massive market for certain powerful groups. It makes a similar case for Libya.
Claiming Gaddafi's push for a gold-backed African currency threatened Western financial systems.
That's the source's assertion, that this threat was a key reason behind the NATO intervention and his death.
And Syria, too. Framed as humanitarian, but the source claims it was really about pipelines and leverage against Russia and Iran.
That's the analysis presented in the source, yes. Regime change for strategic resource and geopolitical advantage.
And crucially, the source loops this back to the Vietnam War itself. It argues it wasn't just about communism.
No, the source claims it was hugely profitable for certain elite families and corporations. It specifically names the Rockefellers for oil and infrastructure.
And obviously, the military contractors who saw enormous growth. This is the specific lens the source uses to interpret that war's motives.
The challenging perspective, definitely presented as the source's analysis.
And building on that theme of elite interests, the source then lists several world leaders it claims were removed or died suspiciously after challenging this alleged system.
Yeah, it presents a pattern. Patrice Lumumba, in the Congo, wanting to nationalize resources, killed with alleged CIA knowledge.
Salvador Allende in Chile, elected socialist, overthrown in a CIA-backed coup.
Muammar Gaddafi, who we just mentioned with the currency idea, killed after NATO intervention.
Saddam Hussein, former U.S. ally, removed based on WMD claims the source argues were questionable.
And bring it back to Vietnam again, Agolo Dinh Diem, South Vietnam's leader, who the source says resisted deeper U.S. involvement and was killed in a CIA-approved coup in '63.
The common thread the source draws is their resistance, either to Western-dominated financial systems or refusing to play along with what it calls imperial strategy.
Again, the source presents these not as isolated events, but as evidence of a pattern of dealing with leaders who don't comply.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all this. We have the long history, the current flashpoint, the U.S. strategic shift.
And then the source's more provocative layers about elite motives and these historical parallels.
The source's central argument seems to be that this Vietnam-China situation, while involving real national issues, is also for them a kind of stage for a bigger global power struggle.
A struggle where, according to the source, America's current actions with Vietnam are driven less by altruism or simple security, and more by these deeper strategic, economic, and elite profit motives it describes.
And the source concludes pretty starkly, doesn't it? That whatever the reasons, whoever is pulling the strings.
It's ordinary people who pay the price.
Hmm.
And the real battlefield, the source says, isn't just military. It's in boardrooms, in the media, controlling trade, even influencing elections.
So we've gone from the South China Sea tensions through the U.S.-Vietnam turnaround and into this source's really challenging analysis of hidden powers and historical precedents.
Quite a journey through this one source's perspective.
And it leaves you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on. The source suggests that seeing through what it calls the fog of propaganda, the official stories, is crucial if people actually want to achieve what the source calls real sovereignty. Something to think about how these different layers presented by the source might or might not apply to understanding other things happening in the world.
Definitely food for thought. Consider these perspectives as you watch global events unfold.